All right, so the pineapple, did y'all know the pineapple is considered to be the symbol of hospitality, right? That's interesting. So you see it on door knockers like the one I got right there. Um, Side note, I wonder if you know if that's real or is that fake behind me there. Let me know afterwards. But you see it on door knockers, and you see, like, I've seen pineapples on the top, like adorning gates that lead into places. Many places have that. Um, where I'm from has in the middle of down at Waterfront Park, there's a humongous pineapple fountain, right? And so pineapples are on all kinds of things. You might even find some pineapples if you come across any old, very, very old church buildings. Way back when they actually started to carve pineapples into some of their woodwork in some old church buildings. And why it came to be this way. Does anybody know the history of pineapple and hospitality? Well, just buckle up, buddy, because this is just amazing. So it used to be a pretty rare fruit, at least for Westerners, right? And so apparently, I'm not so sure if I believe this totally, but to have a pineapple would cost about, in today's dollars, about $8,000. That is mind blowing to me. I've seen more than one source to say that. $800 might sound a little more reasonable, but if that's true, wow. So only the rich would ever get to enjoy a pineapple, Westerners, anyways, And it was only available to the wealthy, only served to, if you didn't just serve it to anybody when they came over, only the best of the best of the best guests got the pineapple, right? But the less common people, they knew about the pineapple. The less wealthy people wanted their guests to feel special, wanted their guests to feel just as welcomed. And so instead of having the real thing, they started making carvings of pineapples, putting it on their tables and embroidering it into napkins and all of this stuff. And it was started to show up in taverns and inns and all of that. And so the trend continues today, where it's become the universal symbol of hospitality. That's pretty interesting, huh? How about that? So what does that mean? So that doesn't that mean that it's hospitality, symbol of hospitality? So that means the church should be like one big pineapple? Is that how that works? Well, maybe there's a better way to say that, right? But I think we can all agree that hospitality among Christians is a big deal. Everybody wants people to know about Jesus Christ, and everybody wants people to be saved and go to heaven, right? And everybody wants congregations to be overflowing with New Testament Christians, but only a few are actually willing to practice everything that is involved with hospitality. And so you have God's will, what he wants us to do, and then he has our stubbornness. And we've kind of come to an impasse, right? So something has to give, and it's going to have to give on our side for progress to be made in this very important area. Let's define hospitality, shall we? So one definition of hospitality is the friendly and generous reception and entertainment of guests, visitors, or strangers. All right? Makes sense? There's another definition given to generous and cordial reception of guests, promising or suggesting generous and friendly welcome, offering a pleasant or sustaining environment, readily receptive, open. Now, did you catch in any of those definitions where you have to have a big house, or you have to have a spotless house? Did you see that where that was like? Or did you catch in there that you have to be able to serve a dessert worthy of a pin on Pinterest? Did you catch that part right? I know hospitable people who have those things and can make those amazing things, but none of those things are what makes them generous and receptive and friendly and open. And if you thought that only elders or other leaders of the church, that's part of their job. And then we little people in the back, we kind of do our part. If you thought that only the leaders of the church are supposed to be hospitable, well, every Christian is told to be, quote, given to hospitality in Romans 12 and verse 13. We'll bring that up a little bit later. And that lies in a list of many other very important commandments for the entire church to follow. And you think, wow, man, I didn't know that verse was there. I guess I'm going to have to try to practice hospitality now. I guess I'm just going to have to do it now. If that's what you're thinking now, let me remind you of 1 Peter 4, verse 9, which says, for us to be hospitable to one another without grumbling. Can't do that. Not supposed to do that. A story about a guy who takes his dog to the vet, and he says, Doc, I need you to chop his tail off. And the vet says, I'm not going to do that. And why are you even asking me such a question like that? Ask him to do this to your poor dog. He says, truthfully, my mother-in-law is coming to visit, and I can't stop her from coming. And so I just don't want anything in the house that would suggest that she's welcome there. You get it? I would hate to think that we have a similar attitude toward being hospitable to other people, whether they're Christian or whether they're not. I wonder what's worse, though, practicing hospitality while grumbling or not practicing hospitality at all. Which do you think is worse? I'm not so sure that I want to find out. Take your mind to Old Testament Hebrew life for a moment, okay? Hebrews considered hospitality to be a commandment. There was no, well, we can or we can't. They were supposed to do it. And it was based upon a combination of God's nature, who God was, and Israel's past. And so if you look in Deuteronomy chapter 10, and verse number 18 and 19, it says, he, God, administers justice for the fatherless and the widow, and God loves the stranger, giving him food and clothing. He says, therefore, you therefore love the stranger. He's telling Israelites, you love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So you see, it's a combination of their past and a combination of the nature of God, right? And so if there was someone who was hungry, or if they were in need of a place to sleep or a place to rest, they considered it their legal obligation to help them. And if they didn't, they'd be breaking the law, breaking God's law. When you read through the book of Job, those of you who've read through Job, you know that Job was so sure that he had done something wrong, right? And all of his friends were telling him, yeah, you messed up somewhere. Surely he had done something wrong because of how he was suffering. And so he says this, Job chapter 31, he says, if I have kept the poor from their desire, he's kind of making his petition to God. God, if I've kept the poor from their desire, if I've caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or eaten my morsel by myself, so that the fatherless could not eat of it. And he goes on to say, God, you need to punish me. You need to punish me. That's Job 31, 16 and 17. So the Hebrews would read that. Job is one of the oldest books, supposedly one of the oldest books in the Bible to be written. Hebrews would read that, and they took that to mean that they should not be eating alone, especially when someone less fortunate could be joining them in their meal. They took that seriously. The first account of hospitality you read about in the Bible is in Genesis 18. This is where Abraham invites 3 travelers to stop and rest while some food was being prepared specifically for them. That's Genesis 18, 1 through 5. And this account is actually, we haven't got there yet on Wednesday night, but this account is referenced in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 2, where the writer says, do not forget to entertain strangers. And you know what? That right there, talking to Christians, is just as much of a command as the verse that comes before it, which says, let brotherly love continue. right? Both commands. If not, why not? And we will read, let brotherly love continue, and we think, well, you know, sometimes that's hard, but yep, that's what we need to be doing. And we strive for that. But when we get to verse number 2, do not forget to entertain strangers, our eyes just go whoop, right off the page. Jewish tradition actually says, that's just tradition, but that Abraham was a man who always left all 4 sides of his tent open when it was possible. And that is so guests could come in and out easily. Now, whether that's true or not, just tradition, whether it's true or not, I think that's a good thought. That should characterize our level of hospitality today. We sometimes will say, haven't you ever told somebody well, my door's always open. I used that little saying this morning. My door's always open. We say that to folks, but do we mean it? Do we mean it? There's some other examples of hospitality in the Old Testament. Rebekah graciously watering Abraham's servants' horses in Genesis 24. She didn't have to do that. Rahab welcoming the spies, right, in Joshua chapter 2. That could have cost her life. She practiced hospitality, though. Elijah receiving hospitality from a widow who was not even a Hebrew, 1 Kings 17. And then you have Elisha being graciously hosted by the Shunammite woman, 2 Kings chapter 4. All right, now those Hebrew principles carried over into Jewish practices to this day. Jews teach that, quote, one's house should always be welcoming and open to strangers. And there's another Eastern proverb that says, every stranger is an invited guest. We don't say those kind of things in America, do we? We certainly don't think that way. It's also true to the Jews that an inhospitable house is considered to be a condemned house. Now, when I think condemned, like you don't go in there because you might get hurt. That's the way they look at an inhospitable house, as if the walls are about to come crumbling down. Don't go in there. There are actually obligations to the guests as well. So hospitality in Jewish culture is respected on both sides of the door, so to speak. So at meals, the guests now are expected to recite an additional blessing, like a prayer after the meal, and they are to bless the host. They're expected to leave some food on their plate and always keep the desires of the host in mind. And the meaning is that the guest does not need to be imposing on their host or extending their visit there longer than, they would say, 3 days. Won't you stay there 3 days? No longer than 3 days. One Jewish commentary says, on the day a guest arrives, a calf is slaughtered in his honor. Well, that's a big deal. The next day, a sheep. The third day, a fowl. And on the fourth day, he is just served beans. In other words, you gots to go, buddy. And that isn't just an Eastern thought. An African proverb says, treat your guest as a guest for 2 days. On the third day, give him a hoe. That man ain't leaving, you put that boy to work. And actually, that echoes a truth found in Proverbs 25:17. And I like this. There's a little bit of humor for me anyways, isn't it? It says, seldom set foot in your neighbor's house, lest he become weary of you and hate you. Now, we could make all kind of funny things about that, but there is such a thing as an abuse of someone's hospitality, don't you think? Now, let's fast forward to the New Testament church and hospitality. Now, first thing we think of hospitality, a lot of us are thinking, yeah, that's a qualification for an elder. And we're right. We're right about that. 1 Timothy 3, Titus chapter 1. And it makes good sense that our elders need to be hospitable people, men who would shepherd God's people. They need to know the people, and they need the people to know them. They need the people to feel welcomed by them and comfortable and safe around them. And so what better way to develop those kinds of relationships than with hospitality, right? It is beyond shocking to me when I learned that members don't know who their shepherds are. There's something wrong about that. And the bulk of the blame should not go to the member. Well, the member needs to be paying attention to the announcements or reading the bulletin. No, I don't. I think the bulk of the responsibility, if that ever happens, should be on the elders. The elders. However, hospitality extends beyond the church's leadership. Don't you think it makes sense that the early church's hospitality was one of the main reasons why the gospel spread so rapidly through the Roman Empire in the first century? Yeah, and it was not at all like Roman hospitality. Now, Roman hospitality was basically you treat well only the important folks. You invite into your home and you show hospitality to the people who are going to be able to repay you back in some way. You see. And what happened was the Pharisees began to adopt some of these Gentile Roman practices, and Jesus called them out on it, brought it to their attention. He says in Luke chapter 14, starting in verse 12, Jesus also said to him who invited him, when you give a dinner or a supper, do not ask your friends, your brothers, your relatives, nor rich neighbors, lest they invite you back and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you shall be repaid at the resurrection of the just. How about that? Christian hospitality was to be extended to all people. Jesus would say, even to the least of these, my brethren. Matthew 25:40. This is how the Lord's church was able to gain a really a worldwide reputation of love, of people who practice love for others. Paul gave hospitality as a defining mark of a Christian. Again, we read this before, Romans 12:13. It says, Christian, we need to be distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality. That word given to, you might see in your Bibles, pursuing hospitality. Striving for hospitality, and the idea is to be seeking out opportunities to practice hospitality, not so much kind of sitting back and waiting for it to literally show up on our doorstep. My attitude about hospitality should not be, well, if a member of the church comes over to my house, I'm gonna invite them in. And now I can check it off the list that I practice hospitality. I mean, we shouldn't be doing that, but inviting people into our homes, especially members of the church, but this idea is we ought to be pursuing it, seeking it. One writer says this, he says, we are not just to receive the stranger when he comes to us, but actually to inquire after and look carefully for strangers, to pursue them and search them out everywhere. And what were the church buildings back then? They looked just like this, right? No electricity. They didn't even look like this. Before there were pews and pulpits, remember, in their meeting places, it was nothing but couches and dinner tables, right? As a quick side note, I know there's some good brethren who struggle with the idea of eating food in the same places that they worship. And I gotta think, man, wow, they would have a difficult time being a Christian in Bible days, because they did everything in the same spot. They ate. Well, they worshiped where they ate. But there were no grand auditoriums. I mean, we're blessed, right? Dina's right. Our building is a blessing. But you guys have seen the church buildings that people have out there. Good night. Host an NFL game in some of those places. There was none of that, none of those kind of buildings back then, not for Christians. So the primary spots for worship, study, and fellowship were the open homes of generous Christians. Go through Acts and Romans 16 and Philemon chapter 1, Colossians 4. That's what made the church stand out. And people began to quickly notice these. Look at these people inviting all kinds of different people, from all different stripes. And they're claiming to be, and they're acting like they're actually family. I'm telling you, the church stood out because of their hospitality. It was a unique marker of a person who followed Jesus Christ. It should still be that way. It should still be that way. Jesus understood the importance of hospitality along with his disciples. Very normal behavior for Jesus to enter into somebody's home and be a partaker of hospitality. Some would say it was actually where he accomplished some of his greatest work, aside from the cross. We see Jesus in the house of Levi, in Matthew and Luke 5. We see him in Peter's home, right, healing his mother-in-law, Matthew 8. He went into a leper's home. Remember, and that was a big no-no. He went to a leper's home, and a woman there anointed him with oil. That's Matthew 26. We see him in the home, maybe the most famous home of all that we can think of, maybe besides Peter's, as Mary and Martha, right? Zacchaeus heard Jesus preaching one time and invited him to come, and so he goes to the home of Zacchaeus. Even after Jesus' resurrection, when he said, "It was finished," and he appeared to his disciples for 40 days, and during those 40 days, he stayed and ate with some of his disciples, Luke 24. Now, we know that Jesus didn't really, he had a home, he had a place, a birthplace, but he didn't really have a home to call his own. But if he did, how open his doors would be, right? All these examples and more show that there was a standard, there was a common practice of Jesus and his disciples, and that was to regularly engage in hospitality. Then these examples, we could keep piling them on, really, I think, and they're overwhelming to us. And it shows us anything. It shows us that it was a significant part of Jesus's earthly ministry. And so if that is the case, why shouldn't hospitality be a significant part of the church's ministry and work today? And that involves everybody. Is it mere coincidence that Jesus referred to himself as the door in John 10 and verse 9? If anyone enters by me, he will be saved. Coincidence? Methinks not. In one of the greatest symbolic teachings about the nature of Christ and the reality of his purpose, we find a very subtle reference to hospitality, don't we? Let's close with this wonderful verse again, 1 Peter 4 and verse 9. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling. It has been well said, folks. Some people make you feel at home. Others make you wish you were. Who are you? Remember, we're trying to practice biblical hospitality, not biblical hostility. And those are different. So the gospel was effectively taught to many people, and the church grew by leaps and bounds because, not the only reason, but because of hospitality. The church was strengthened and the church was edified despite all the hardships that they were going through, because, not the only reason, but because of hospitality. And the world, and maybe this is what Jesus prayed for in John 17. The world was able to see the love of God displayed among his people because of hospitality. And we have got to be those people. The invitation is open if you need to respond to it. You're here and you haven't obeyed the gospel. Would you like to sit down and study the Bible and see what you need to do to be saved? It's a big decision. It's a huge commitment. And I have a lot of respect for people who really want to sit down and ask questions and ask questions and ask questions to make sure that it's the right thing to do. So don't be ashamed when you say, well, I don't agree with that. But we ought to be ashamed when we're unwilling to open the Bible up. Do you want to study? Because I want to study with you. You need to obey the gospel and be saved, and be sure that you've done that. Maybe there's someone here tonight that has been failing miserably in hospitality. You've been shutting the door on people, on opportunities, when you should have been opening your door. The church in the first century grew for very specific reasons. And God is not such a God to where he only makes things work at the beginning. No, 2,000 years later, where we're sitting about right now in the big timeline, what God gave and how people did things to make things work still works. And you shouldn't doubt it. If there's any sin in your life you need to repent of, I hope you'll take care of it now. Let's grab our songbooks, stand and sing.